This presentation is part of a workshop voicing indigenous food sovereignty struggles, which has been organized by the project Indigenous Food Systems in Transition, financed by Future Food at the Swedish University for Agricultural Sciences. Furthermore, the workshop was organized in collaboration with Case Study 18 of the Horizon 2020 Finance project Just North. You are welcome to listen to the lecture.
And now I would like to give a word to our next presenter, Kamrul Hossain, the director of the Northern Institute for the Environmental and Minority Law and the research professor at University of Lapland. His presentation will offer an insight into the protection and promotion of traditional food systems of the Arctic indigenous peoples through the lens of human rights and human security. Please, Kamrul, you are welcome.
Thank you, Elena, for nice introduction. Can you see my slide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I can start. Okay, thank you so much once again, and good morning to everybody. And I'm already introduced by Elena. My name is Kamrul Hossain. What I'm going to present is a chapter that I contributed in the book. As you can see, the picture, the cover page of the book, and it was published from a project where myself, Ildiko, Elena, we all participated. And in the book, we were actually looking into food security perspectives from the European High North region. Of course, we had Canadian contributors also in the book, so we had some comparative perspectives. My chapter in the book was concerning the human rights issues that are applicable to food security and traditional food systems for indigenous people. So basically, in the beginning, I mean, I just tried to in the chapter. Actually, this chapter was written by myself and my colleague Poonam Noor, who is a PhD student at the University of Lapland. So we tried to look into the conceptualization of traditional food system, how traditional food system is conceptualized and how it is applicable when we talk about indigenous peoples and their rights, not only from the consumption perspectives, but also from other perspectives. And then we try to bring legal aspects and legal provisions, especially from the perspectives of human rights law, how they support the protection and access to traditional food system for the indigenous people. So access to traditional food system is a right, particularly for traditional communities such as indigenous people. A food system refers to an integrated aspect of production, processing, consumption, and it also encompasses everything from the natural condition to the waste management. So the whole process is included, as you have already learned from Ildiko's presentation about the food system. So food system consists of activities. For example, food is collected, produced locally from available natural resources, and then food is shared, consumed locally as part of customary food practices, and processed for wider distribution within and also beyond the region. So it does not deny having food from imported sources. For example, coffee, tea, or other kind of food production or food kind of elements which are not available in the region, they can be also imported and integrated within the traditional food system. So there is no harm bringing exported food if they are not available within the food regime in the particular context we are looking into. So traditional food has its value to provide required dietary needs. That is one of the importance why we talk about traditional foods and traditional food system. And nutritious value for not only health, but also for psychological well-being or mental well-being. They play an important role to fight against number of diseases concerning that affect actually local population. So why it is important? It is important because, as I said, that food is not only used for physical consumption, it also involves sociocultural, emotional, psychological value, and it also has a connection to local and traditional knowledge that are used when foods are produced from naturally available resources. And then that also provides stability for the food system to continue in a sustainable way, and ecological conservation and function of ecosystems are also dependent on such system. And then it gives also certainty, and at the end it also promote human security as it relates to food security. So yeah, so it's as I said, that is also important for food security to maintain traditional food system. But for indigenous people, particularly, why it is important is that it is also connected to their right to self-determination, where they have their control, or they establish their control on the system. And this is something in most parts sometimes is missing. And I will show actually in my presentation, or I'll talk a little bit about the problem that we are facing, especially in the European High North context. So I would not want to go into detail about food sovereignty issue, as Ildiko has touched upon that. And I think during today and the next day, we will have more presentation on that. So to talk about food security, Ildiko has touched upon that, but I just repeat again that, I mean, the definition for food security is repeatedly, used in literature, saying that when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. So in the Arctic, the impacts of climate change leading to increase in diverse human activities drastically affect the land use behavior. And they result in alteration of traditional food system. So that is the problem in the Arctic. And then mining and other extractive industrial developments, infrastructural projects such as proposed Arctic Railroad in Finnish context, for example, or installation of wind turbines on indigenous lands. These kind of activities bring major disruptions in traditional activities, contributing to food practices in the region. So climate change negatively affects some food resources, that is true, but also temperature rise at times help produce agricultural products in ways that are more helpful. However, such production are not often sufficient. So there are 4 issues when we talk about food security. One is availability, meaning that food is available. Other one is access, meaning that in terms of economic means, you can have access to the food, and also in terms of proximity. And then sustainability, another component, meaning that food is available in a sustainable way. There is a certainty of having enough and sufficient food. And then the final part is utilization, meaning that the food has to have traditional dietary needs required for the people who are relying on that kind of food. So food security is impacted if one of these 4 elements is missing. While referring to Nordic part of the Arctic, much of the traditional food practices remain insecure. And this is because region is infrastructurally well developed and well networked by roads and highways. So infrastructure is very good. Therefore, the imported or store-bought foods are more available, especially in the except for Russian Arctic probably, but in the Nordic Arctic, they are more available and can be found with cheaper price. So since they're available, affordable, and their supply is sustainable, so there are 3 components that are met of food security. However, they do not offer required nutritious value that are needed for the traditional communities, for example, Sami people or other local people living in the region. So that affects food security when we talk about indigenous peoples of the Nordic, indigenous people of the Nordic Arctic part. So local and indigenous Sami community, their rights are jeopardized, and since utilization part of the food system is missing, and which is, as I said, that about meeting dietary needs and nutritious values for the food. Now, what are the problems? So there are problems like impacts of climate change, increased human activities. I just talked about that. So let me just skip this. Okay, so yeah, this is also something that I touched upon. Okay, now let us go to human rights framework that are applicable when we talk about food. Right to food can be actually explained from different perspectives. We can also bring individual rights perspective connecting to food, and also we bring collective dimension that are applicable for the community or indigenous people. So stable food system requires integration of local and traditional knowledge, and that is when we talk about community right, that ensure meaningful participation of communities in the protection and promotion of the food system, and which is part of the food sovereignty component, which means that there is a right integrated within the food system that can be explained from the concept of self-determination as it applies to indigenous people. So when food as a general human rights, we talk about International Bill of Human Rights. First, we see that how International Bill of Human Rights endorsed provisions to promote food security, or to bring food as a human right applicable to individuals and applicable to communities. International Bill of Human Rights referred to actually three documents. One is Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So as you can see from this slide, Article 25 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 11 of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and Article 6 of International Covenant on civil and political rights, they are applicable to concerning right to food. So food has not been actually very clearly referred to in this article, but there are other elements that can be included when we talk about food as a human right. For example, adequate living standard for all people that were endorsed in these provisions, which is which cannot be undertaken without ensuring a right to food. And especially for Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it is about a right to life. And right to life cannot be imagined when you don't have a right to access to food, sufficient nutritious food, and also it is also connected to right to health. So as I said, that these provisions did not directly refer to food as a human right, but there are elements within these provisions that can be explained using food as a component for promoting and protecting these rights. In particular, Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is about right to life, that has been explained by General Comment 36, and General Comment 36 is a general comments are actually the statement. They are called authoritative statements, and these statements are provided by the treaty monitoring body. For ICCPR, the treaty monitoring body is Human Rights Committee, and then Human Rights Committee bring these general comments to guide the state parties to apply particular provisions of the covenant. So in this context, Article 6 was kind of explained by the General Comment 36, and then General Comment 36 clearly referred to food. So as you can see, that food can be then connected as part of International Bill of Human Rights, where General Comment 36 stated that a threat to lack of sufficient healthy food can be explained to have an effect on right to life, as the dignity of, they also refer to indigenous people, and that is connected to indigenous people when we talk about community right. Then, as I said, that for right to food cannot be explained only as a right for physical food, as for physical consumption. It can be also used for emotional, psychological, and kind of cultural value, and that are explained by also Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 15 of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In these articles, actually, they did not refer to indigenous people, but they refer to minorities, that minorities are protected to practice their own culture, to participate in their own culture in community with other members of the group. And we know that indigenous peoples form minorities in most of the countries. Therefore, this article applies to indigenous people as well. And then again, as I said, that general comments were adopted to explain these particular articles, in particular Article 27 of ICCPR, which was explained by General Comment 23, how culture has to be interpreted and how food is connected to that culture. I will come to that point in my next slide. But before that, also let me just touch upon some of the other articles. Article 47 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and 25 of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights talked about right to enjoy and utilize fully and freely natural wealth and resources. And they are very clearly connected to protect right to food. And then Article 1 of the ICCPR and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights talked about people's right to self-determination. And people's right to self-determination is about pursuing their own economic, social, and cultural development, and to freely dispose their natural wealth and resources, and with the right not to be deprived of one's own means of substance. And the similar language you can find also in United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And this can be explained from the viewpoint of food sovereignty of indigenous people. So as I said that I would not go into the food sovereignty issues here because there will be other presentations probably. But let me talk about this cultural part of the indigenous people's right to participate in food practices. So if we just look at the Article 27, it is let me just read the article. It says that in those states in which ethnic, religious, linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, and to use their own language. But then culture cannot be understood in a very narrow form. As you can see from this slide, General Comment 23 of Article 27 clearly says that culture manifests itself in many forms. A particular way of life associated with the use of land resources, traditional activities, fishing, hunting, and the right to live in reserves protected by law. So it means that culture has to be interpreted in a broader term, meaning that traditional practices, I just mentioned fishing and hunting, but it's not limited only to fishing and hunting. It could be other such activities that are connected to land and that also provide food, not only as a means for consumption, but also as a means for practicing culture. And that is very well covered with Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And then general comments also very clearly mention that it is not a negative right, meaning that the state, it's not just that a state will refrain from doing something, it is also about taking protective and proactive measures so that the right can be preserved and right can be protected, so that traditional food system can be maintained by...
Excuse me, Kamrul.
Yes.
So if it's possible to conclude a little
bit.
Okay. We are run out of time.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm almost ending. So that's the way food, traditional food system has to be preserved. And in this connection, I also would like to say that even without referring to Article 1 of self-determination, General Comment clearly says that participatory right is part of the indigenous people's culture or indigenous people's right to practice culture. So that is well articulated in also UNDRIP. So in UNDRIP, as you can see from this slide, Article 17, 21, 23, 24, and Article 29 are very well applicable for indigenous people to exercise their right, for example, to have a free, prior, and informed consent that can be applicable in regard to food practices. And then there are a few other instruments like in the Racial Discrimination Convention and ILO Convention 169. They also ensure participatory right of indigenous people, and that can be applicable also in terms of food practices. In addition to human rights law, We have also Biodiversity Convention, where indigenous people's traditional knowledge and traditional practices are recognized. And that is also for nature conservation and also for biodiversity conservation. And they can be also connected to food practices of indigenous people in terms of promoting their traditional food system. So with this word, I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.